Hello, today is April 9th, 2019. This is the standard SIG cluster lifecycle call. Let's open up the agenda here real quick. If you could add your details to the meeting notes, that'd be useful. The agenda is really light. In fact, it's non-existent. I did have a couple of topics I wanted to discuss today. There's one topic which I didn't add, which is it's sprung up from all of these. As SIG cluster lifecycle has a broader set of subprojects underneath its umbrella, like the add-on subproject was newly formed, and we have these other subprojects, like I saw Thomas there. So we have Minikube, we have kubeadm, we have Cluster API. And part of like what recently transpired in the Cluster API group is folks are trying to sort of distill down a broader set of scope and requirements, right? It's basically to channel what is in scope for this project, what is out of scope for the project. What are the lines or the delineation points where we sort of say like, no, like that's a good idea, we consider this out of scope. And I find the current documentation structure very lacking. Like we have KEPs, and that's very good for a design spec, but it's not very good for sort of having like sort of architectural awareness, like objectives and scope boundaries, just higher level documents that sort of outline like this is where this project begins and ends, and this is where this other project begins and ends. So I wanted to like get feedback from the broader group on thoughts around this.
I think it's definitely a good thing to raise. I'm not sure how we would define it. I feel like we've been talking about it. Like we had our kickoff meeting for add-on operators on Friday, and definitely the scope was a big topic of conversation there. But it does feel like we're making those decisions pretty locally. We're not necessarily empowered to like determine our scope locally. I don't know how we would do that. And I think the other thing is, I think that came out of Cluster API is we want to make sure that things work together, even though they are cross boundaries, but that the other sides are also replaceable. In other words, that we are sympathetic to things across the wall, but not coupled to things across the wall.
Yeah, I'm struggling for vernacular here. If someone wants to help, it's more like because Vince and I were talking about updating a doc in the Cluster API repository. I called it originally mission and scope, and scope and objectives is another one. High-level requirements are another way to say this. But I think it would help the subprojects tremendously to have something written down that basically allows folks to have the conversation without having to rehash or to relitigate a lot of the details of why choices were made, right? Because if you come into the conversation and have sort of the understanding of, oh, it's got kind of shaped like this, then you can easily ascertain that, oh, this is out of scope for this project. And it doesn't become conflating, right? What do you think, Thomas?
I have more. Go ahead.
I agree about having this clarified. I would be happy to help out in defining clarifying statements on this. I'm not sure what the next step on this is.
I think we're going to PR Cluster API as an example, but I don't think it's a done thing, right? I think it needs a lot more thought about how we start to do this across subprojects, right? SIG cluster lifecycle, I think, was born uniquely to be a group of federated repositories and to distill down the common best practices. But in order to do that and not sort of like, I don't know, become yet another installer, is we specifically said like these are out of scope, right? And by doing that helped to keep the conversation bounded. And as we add more and more subprojects, making sure that we have the bounded scope, I think will help conversations, especially when new folks come online, right? So defining what is in scope and out of scope, and right now, when we want to adopt a new sub-project, we create a cap. And I think that's actually the wrong thing to do now, when I think about it, because in reality, you might have a design idea, but as you start to iterate on it, that thing will probably change wildly, but the scope shouldn't.
So, and I think just a briefly, is that what you're describing is typical in startups, for instance, when you define the mission? Because basically something that should, the main objective of the mission of a company project is to decide, as you said, what is not, what is outside. But the requirements, you previously define like high-level requirement. Requirement is tricky because requirement depends a lot on the evolution of the project or the evolution of the ecosystem. I mean, you can keep the same objective or mission stable over a very long time, and actually you need to update your requirements if you want to catch up with the ecosystem. For me, there are like two different levels of very differentiated level of definition, but definitely we need both. One should be more stable, but should not be based on a specific feature. You know, it's more like, I would say, conceptual scope.
I think that's fair. I think it's okay to even revise the mission a little bit, like over time. Not totally rewrite history, but refine it, right? Because sometimes when you as you scope down a project over time and you kind of refine what you're trying to do, you want it to be more explicit, right? Because sometimes when you first start something, it's usually broader in scope, and then as you start to iterate on it, the refinement narrows the scope. Well, if folks have thoughts on this, let it percolate in the background. If folks have thoughts there, I'm all ears, because I think this problem exists for Kubernetes. I think we are probably the first group to really hit it because of the nature of what we do. But I think that I think how we form sub-projects needs to be refined a little bit, and how we document the scope. I think would help to bring people on board to understand what are the guardrails for a sub-project as well. So that way sub-projects don't kind of grow or accrete too many things underneath its umbrella, right? Where does it stop? Right? When do you stop becoming the monolith?
Maybe also define, for instance, in this case, this new group or sub-project of the add-on is being created, defining that really belongs to the here or should be an independent project. Because if you have a clear scope or mission, at some point there might be a tension with other, sub-projects, say they want to cover more, and at some point you need to decide what the best way to go is, that they limit their scope or just go along. So in the long term, it's important to have this boundary for everyone.
As a SIG, we allow competition though too. The SIG is the umbrella, the clearinghouse for this things to exist. So currently there are overlapping tools that exist, and what happens is the evolution over time. We kind of sponsor or put more horsepower behind one. Right? So I think it's fine to have that multiple ideas and see which one wins out. That's an okay thing too. I think what we're seeing is as our tools have matured that we've created, we're getting a lot more people involved. There's a lot broader engagement, and being able to have a focused conversation is really important, because when you have 40 people in a call or 38 people in a call, we want to make sure that we can basically put the stamp and be like, this is out of scope. I understand your use case, but we want to be able to say that because we have 40 people. We want to be mindful of everybody's time. So me as a facilitator of a SIG, as a chair, it's incumbent upon me to find and make sure that everybody's respectful and using each other's time appropriately and wisely, right? Because otherwise there could be sprawling conflict issues, etc.
So I, for one, think the idea of having kind of the higher level concerns and topics for a project be a separate document is probably a really good thing, because then if you want to talk about expanding or contracting the scope of the project, you can talk about it at the higher kind of level within that scope of that kind of single document that describes that, versus something like the KEP, which also goes into design, where you end up going into tangents talking about implementation details. And when you have those meetings with a large group of folks, especially if some of them are relatively new to the project, it's really easy, I think, to focus on the implementation details over kind of the higher overarching concepts. So I think being able to scope discussions at the right level is important when we're dealing with this many people.
Something that I wouldn't say worry, I don't find the word right now, but it's like a concern I have is that, for instance, around in the Cluster API, having this conversation around the machine controller and the machine part, because there are some requirements that seems to be outside the scope or the regional scope of Cluster API, which is perfectly fine, but at the same time are applicable to other use cases. And then the tension here is what to do, because there are people like me and other people that are interested in this other topic, but it probably makes no sense just to create a different project just to tackle them. Even when they are outside the regional scope, I mean, it's tricky to maintain that as this is mature, because machine is the most mature part of the Cluster API. It's natural that now the people working there are addressing other concerns, but what to do? I mean, create a different project and sub-project. That's something that is around. It's interesting to define that at some point, how to make this execution happen.
I think refining it, like you start out with a bounded, refined scope, and then you evaluate the use cases and you determine whether or not you need to change the scope, right? And if it falls, if as long as it doesn't conflict with your other requirements and your overall mission, then refining the mission and objectives, or scope and objectives document, makes a ton of sense. But I think you do it on a case-by-case basis, and it should be the exception versus the norm. So in kubeadm, it's different because most of the kubeadm contributors have been around and they're core contributors for a long time. So like it's almost implicitly known of what is in scope and out of scope. We have been a lot less explicit because we know each other and we've been working on this project for like 2 years. We basically say like the boundary lines are here. We're not going to cross that, right? This is where component config should clearly take hold, right? And we have that shared understanding. But when you have this broader group of people, documenting it is almost a requirement. And then even use the document as a foil to determine whether or not you need to refine it, or figure out a way where you can do it outside of it too.
Yeah, because I feel that it's not inside outside, because as I said, it's like overlapping. At some point, probably make no sense to take apart just outside the project or create a parallel project just to cover some use cases that are outside the regional scope, but they are relevant to some part of the community. Mm-hmm. And that's the situation that the machine is happening, is that there are some requirements that probably, if you look at the objective or the scope of the Cluster API are outside, and it's valid that are outside, but at the same time, it's like you say, but I can reuse what you already have. I just only want to add some use cases that are relevant for other parts. What to do there? Because, it's like fork. The usual answer is, let's fork the project. But the forking the project at the long term, basically, what does is dilute the effort in several sub-communities. And I'm not saying I don't know the answer, but this is something that is happening right now. Just bringing it because it's something that is happening in the last week. Some conversation around the machine and what to do about that.
I think the Machines API is well understood to make it composable and extensible. I think people are also talking past each other. I think the implementation details are debatable, right? I think the overall broader mission of the Machines API and what people want to do is encompassed within the broader set of requirements. I think people are reading past certain ideas. That's a very specific use case scenario. And a part of this has to do with making sure that we actually write down a design spec and see what happens, which is a KEP, and then going from there. And actually write down an implementation detail. There's nothing wrong with forking an implementation to use as a POC to have the conversation. In fact, I think that's the best way to do it, because then it gives us an action point for us to have a conversation.
I just wanted to chime in and saying that having this level of clarification is really useful for long-term maintenance of a project as well, because it gives you a document that you can cite when you're reviewing PRs or issues to basically say, this is not in scope for our project. In Minikube, we have a principles doc that we do cite sometimes, but I wish we went a little bit further into the non-goal section, for instance.
Yeah, and I think the same problem is going to happen with add-ons, right? Add-ons is a very, like, where do you stop with add-ons and where do apps begin, right? That it's tough, right? That's not an easy question.
I'm hoping the answer there is that we don't want to build all those add-ons. We just want to build the framework. If someone wants to build the add-ons for things that are apps, that's okay, as long as it doesn't need changes to the framework that pushes it outside our core scope. But yes, I am currently optimistic, and I am sure time will change that.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm asking for the broader group here is maybe come up with a couple of names, or if somebody wants to help me, I could use all the help here because I'm bad at naming. I come up with like one good name every 4 years, and then I hold on to it and I scroll it down. And that's like my first winning moment, because naming is one of the hardest things in computer science. So if folks want to help me with sort of defining a way for a taxonomy for us to converse about this more broadly and uniformly, I'd much appreciate that. But I do think it's not a unique problem to Kubernetes, but I think we are probably the first SIG to really try to tackle it. And I do think it's a problem that will only grow over time. So we're witnessing it now across these sub-projects, especially as we add more, and there's a large group of people trying to get engaged. So I want to make sure that we kind of refine this process as a community. That's the only topic I had for today. Are there other topics that folks wanted to discuss? I wanted to briefly mention that we have a separate meeting at KubeCon EU. I wasn't here last time. I was throwing my kids down water slides. But there is we have a space at KubeCon EU for SIG cluster lifecycle. Maybe a topic like today, which is much more broader in scope, we can start to converse about. I think we might want to talk about like different sub-projects and how they mash together, right? Because the broader story that we want to tell would be a really good one, a really powerful one over time. For those who aren't aware, I was just on a call with a CNCF like an hour ago, which was like a customer use case CNCF forum. And it's surprising what people do in the wild. There's still a heck of a lot of homegrown, DIY, rolled your own meta environment. That's actually the most common thing I see, which is kind of interesting and terrifying at the same time. So I figure trying to get those people, that broader group, into the fold to understand, and us having a picture where like they don't need to take everything, they could take pieces of the puzzle, I think would be a good conversation to have and to sort of articulate to the broader community.
I actually really like that. I think that's key. The idea that we are producing these sub-projects and that they should be, I guess, incrementally adoptable, and not just like incrementally adoptable in tooling like COPS or KubeSpray, but like if you've rolled your own, it should be easy to incrementally adopt.
I'm welcome to other topics or ideas too during that time. It's rare that we get face-to-face time. So if folks want to help, if somebody wants to take point and potentially curate an agenda, or maybe this is one of those topics, I happily could use some help on this one.
Yeah, Tim, with regard to KubeCon, Lucas wanted me to bring up whether or not we are preparing or planning or nominating people. Apparently at the Contributor Summit, there's going to be a little bit of a different structure, is what I heard. And we need to have some people who are like ready to lead a session or something like that.
I've already got a session spec'd out. Okay. So what I'm doing right here is talking about the agenda of what we want to do in that session. So if somebody wants to help curate that agenda, then that would be highly useful.
So we need somebody for our SIG cluster lifecycle session at the Contributors Summit to prepare an agenda ahead of time so that we have a directed conversation.
It would help to facilitate the conversation. It doesn't need to be super prescriptive. I expect, given the broad swath of contributors, that it shouldn't be. But I want to be able to entertain sort of meta topics that apply across the state space. Like the meta topic of being able to, how do we converse to the community and have documentation in place to say, like, you can take these pieces of the puzzle to help solve your broader problem, is a common theme. I see that theme all the time. Every single KubeCon I've ever gone to, and I do the poll of like, who uses this tool, who uses that tool, who rows their own. The roll their own segment is the 50+%. Are there any other group topics that folks want to discuss? If not, we can get 30 minutes of our life back. Going once, twice, 3 times. Okay, thanks everybody.